Hello everyone, today we conclude and really conclude our series about Roman strategy and tactics from the 2nd century BC to the 6th AD. In the last episode we had to finish, but basically we realized this was better suited for a 3 videos episode due to the obviously not just breadth, but in this sense also relevance of the themes discussed. I know that repeating a certain type of video in a row, namely a week, may snooze attention off, but there is a specific schedule here to keep up with. Actually, last year I interrupted a similar situation with specific videos that I knew much more than the otherwise, in fact, much appreciated and sort of interest driving Roman army would be sort of better to dilute over the years. So I'm waiting for a moment to be particularly rich in views to intersperse the remnants of those episodes that turned out to be longer, but for some reason did not catch too much the eye or in general the attention of the users. I say this because, as you know, in the last year, I began to cover also much more sort of freely chosen topics that mostly revolve around specific series. There are different genres about it that tend to be likable, but I treat therefore as more like a jolly, like of my choosing, rather than the cycle/lottery that provides you in part with this videos. I also made something a bit more about the Roman army. I think we have really to talk more about, especially the later Roman period. But there is so much to do about classical antiquity still. And for that, it's true that Roman history is the only part of antiquity that here we have ever, since the sort of the first years of Schwerpunkt, treated also through basic manualistic history, not just warfare. However, I'm thinking about gradually extending probably other branches of the ancient history series, because even though my channel focuses more on medieval history, and we talk a lot about ancient history, and I would like, in fact, in these years to mostly build a continuum with modern contemporary history in particular. I think that there are some topics that are worth discussing for ancient history that require, however, some further background. And so balancing everything out like this is much more complicated than it seems. Talking about the Roman army is, say, never like a blank page crisis moment for me. And on the contrary, as you see from these videos, actually there is always so much, too much even, to cover in a single episode, and this is generally speaking valid for any topic we normally cover on Schwerpunkt. What it takes to explain people in 2026 why Roman history, Roman warfare is important. Sometimes you wonder, if people haven't really received the wrong vibes. I was horrified by listening what was perhaps my first Mary Beard interview, at least for 10 minutes. I will skip the entire details of the context of whatever, and to realize that a great part of sort of the strange cultural or subcultural feelings that emerge from this era and from certain parts of the world seem to unfortunately affect a great part of what sort of people tend to feel, really. So I'm talking emotion in particular when exposed to certain specific topics. It may sound strange, but for example, whenever I made some videos about Viking history, I rarely got this enormous amount of views, right? Whenever I talked also more recently about the Roman army, yes, I got a substantial amount of views, but this would you expect to be some kind of driver, right? It's true that there is a lot more Roman history out there, not actually that much Viking history at all. You would be surprised to hear. And this could be extended to some probably hardcore Western topics in many ways. Sometimes even when you talk, I don't know, about American warfare, probably the United States, I guess even famous battles. In May, we're approaching our June rituals. Like, I remember the Point du video receiving an incredibly scarce amount of views, made last summer a video on Midway as well, you would expect Schwerpunkt may be worth being listened because, he covers, though as an overview, that in that case, such an important battle or World War II. Like, we should listen because this is going to be sort of, not because Schwerpunkt is necessarily particularly insightful, for whichever reason you follow me, right? I presume that what you care about is mostly, yes, there is a bit of a not necessarily Easter egg kind of vibe, considering the relative niche content of my videos, the theme of my content. Often to some people, so that may be a factor. But if we're going to talk about the fundamentals of certain things and things that people think they kind of know and they're somehow aware of, and that, however, often turns out to be exactly the ones in which they're more deficient, and that maybe affect their, exactly because being the most important structure, like, affects a bit the rest of all the other, the knowledge, like what properly that knowledge rests on, history-wise, and all the rest. So I think that we must talk much more about specific topics and not especially sectorializing them as, okay, well, now, I just care about, say, Roman history or medieval history. I will not watch the other eras. This is a very destructive attitude, especially whenever it comes to the art of war. You know that this channel is art of war based. It's not even military history based. It's properly designed in many ways, among the other things, like there is also more spiritual soul to it, but it's in fact actually stemming from the same art of war series. Some of you will know that is something, in fact, much deeper than I will tell you what actually happened in this battle, in this campaign. I'll tell you how this army was organized. But let's say explaining how we know this, and especially what is that we may have gotten wrong, and or at least popularized in an inconsistent fashion. And so, actually, the whole purpose is to familiarize people with a bit of criticism and analysis of sort of bigger topics that, when exposed, show you, in fact, more universal dynamics than they seem, and that, however, require a bit more discipline and sort of cold blood, so to say, to be able to handle, right, and to use for properly analyzing also the rest and being able to understand, especially the specificities, exactly through the universal lens, which is, in general, from probably a moral and scientific point of view, what most people have been properly removed from their heads, right? The fact that you cannot have a linear or dichotomic historical or moral or whatever political compass if you're not capable of handling a double-threaded understanding of reality, which has nothing to do with relativism or subjectivity, which unfortunately is what substantiates the former. You will fail at life. It's not like you will not know history or you will remain an ignorant for the rest of your existence. It's just that things will become incredibly difficult for you. In the world, mentally, socially, you must understand how things work, right, in this nature of ours. And without the art of war, if you know the difference, by the way, between the art of war and military history, you should, because you follow me, and I explicitated the definition hundreds of times for not having to repeat it, at least at any point, but encouraging you in this way to properly dig more into my work. If you really care, or if you really have understood what kind of actual enlightenment derives from studying certain topics. So, in the past videos, you can check out what we mostly discussed. We analyzed the Roman army as a whole. Mostly it's organic. We talked about tactics as well, formations. We talked about naval warfare a bit as well. We say this video titles sound like up to the Justinianean Era included, but we are mostly talking about the previous period. Like in the first video of the episode, we discussed up to the Strategicon, fundamentally, that, as you know, is a must in many ways for sort of for recapping, so to say, what ancient warfare had been up to that point, how they had arrived to that point. We didn't talk so much about the 6th century per se. We stretch up to it in certain circumstances, but as you can see from the pictures, we basically remained within a broader late antiquity, which you can consider the Justinianean era to have also been part of, but say not conventional, and say let's put 476. Certain dates are important anyway. It doesn't matter how sort of misused they were, or how they may not actually mean what most people think they mean, but say they are still useful because we all have an idea of how to immediately categorize, scan, sort of for the sake of didactic efficacy, so to say. Today, we will talk about an interesting set of topics from technical to broader political ones. And there is an aspect that we also dedicated an entire playlist to, and it is one of the most famous, in fact, about the Roman army. That is the nature of field fortifications, playing notoriously a major role in Roman operations. As a leitmotif of the previous videos, we obviously highlight the fact that the Roman fortificatory art, polyursatics, whatever has to do with any technical aspect, was not simply like that is also wrong. The story, the Romans simply copied stuff, right? We have to understand the development of any military through the general capacities and resources of the time, which are not in this sense to be particularly scanned either. I mean, the Romans were definitely a civilization. Say, when you look at so-called barbarian warfare, you can't draw a line, say, okay, these guys did not use sophisticated torsion catapults, right? They did not have any major polyurcetic capacity compared to the great Roman and Hellenistic civilization in Mediterranean. There are some radical material cultural divides that make, in fact, Rome what it is, and say whatever they also conquered, functional part of the same, with sort of major investment and reform from the Roman side after the conquest and with Romanization. But there is a reason if people live like tribes outside sort of the range of direct occupation of the Roman army that somehow controls them anyway, and also uses them as soldiers on their own rather than just fighting them, etc. So field fortifications belong evidently to a much wider civilizational legacy. All right, there is nothing about technical aspects that somehow we should simply put limits to. It's obvious that polyursatics, in many ways, the name itself, as you know, stems from especially the Hellenistic era in many ways. But we made multiple videos showing how since millennia before Christ, we look at particularly warlike peoples. We talk about siege techniques and logistics and pioneers and military engineering in general for everybody, for the ancient Egyptians, for the Assyrians, etc. We know how this material culture gradually spread across the Mediterranean, starting from the east. Eventually, the Romans were Hellenized, and they gradually absorbed, even from peoples like the Carthaginians that were of Hellenistic military school, even though they did not really fight like the Macedons. Hellenistic warfare and, let's say, Hellenistic Macedonian phalangitic warfare are something different, or at least overlapping, but the former contains the latter. So you see, in these videos, it's important to get the fundamentals straight. If you're interested in that kind of vision, it's not like I want to brag about my own sort of background in the field, but you can be safe enough that here we are taking the time probably to explain everything on the basis of what defines things in an objective way, not some sort of abstract narrative or, maybe we have to see, we don't know. No, there is a pretty sound, concrete art of war and scale, proper military operations that we're aware of, not just through merely documentary history or archaeology per se, but obviously the proper historiographical criticism and analysis and criticism of the same evidence. That is what we do here. The Romans are considered like the apotheosis of military engineering in the ancient world in particular, and this is definitely correct. Like, the Romans largely operated on the basis of material culture, engineering, and other technical capacities that the Hellenistic world had laid at sort of the disposal of the conqueror, so to say, but they also perfected and refined some Hellenistic inventions, and for their own specific strategical and operational needs, did also reach levels of giantism that were not sort of unique elite, a bit like the at the end of the day dysfunctional Hellenistic ones, or maybe even abstract and sort of fantasy Hellenistic ones from treatises and the bit that Hellenic mentality that overly theorizes. In that, for an empire like Rome in scale and duration, by the way, we can heavily document as properly systematic structure. Like if you wonder why Europe, the Mediterranean, does not have a whole lot of, Hellenic aqueducts, roads or whatever. It's because, again, the Romans did something, admittedly also later, and on the basis of same, again, Hellenic science and technology and so on, but largely because it ran that empire that we know for a greater amount of time with the actual practice and practicality that particularly characterized the Roman mindset, coming from sort of more squared, straightforward, primitive, but in this sense also more direct and sort of fact, action-oriented, traditional mentality of the Romano Italics. This topic is very interesting because the Romans also operated through like many different theaters against so many different peoples, and there is this kind of stereotype that fundamentally the Romans were just affluent, right? Some people would like to essentially discredit the Roman conquest in general for whichever ethnic sympathy or whatever, would basically argue that the Romans had simply more resources than other peoples. And this is partly true when you look at sort of which kind of resources. If we're talking about moral resources, this is true. When we're talking about manpower, this is true. The question is always what keeps that together, right? There is not like even a Romano-Italic confederacy that comes out of nowhere that for some reason is more durable, aggressive, successful in conquering than other peoples. Like you have to choose. Like if it is your line of thinking, either the other peoples were stupid or they were weak or whatever. This is not instead how any of this works like. And when you look at the actual war zones where the Romans fought, more often than not, they were just outnumbered, but they had also a scarcity of resources, materially speaking, that they made up for, however, given the professional discipline background of their legionnaires and a sort of pretty, again, old at that point, largely depending on what we're talking about, military culture that was also a hybrid between that sort of more Hellenistically sophisticated and barbarically primitive. And this is actually a merit. Like if you look at the Romans, there's also a blend between different sort of, I can't say schools of thought, but probably like worldviews and cultural backgrounds. You realize that their synthesis was successful for a reason, because it really used what was already inherent, that situational context where the Romans emerged from, and that allowed them to, in fact, prevail. That's what I always say. If the Romans were so many, like you have to explain how a city conquered the world, and that obviously is a question that can be answered only if you speak metaphysics, I would say, first of all, but even more concretely, moral forces, right? Because otherwise these things do not happen, and either you have to sort of downplay certain aspects of other people unfairly or sort of overrate them, but still not at that point explaining how or why things happen. And one aspect of the Roman military that is actually probably under discussed, I don't know whether this is quite the case considering the historiography available at this point in the talk, but generally speaking, everybody knows more or less Roman combat or imagines at least tactics, formations, and we were hypercritical about this also in the previous video because, telling the truth, most people do not really know much about even the relatively contained primary sources and the obvious limits that there is in any possible reconstruction of Roman tactics, etc., and that would like instead to, in fact, make up with sort of a lot of imagination and presumption, so to say. the Romans had an incredibly advanced military engineering mindset, right? More than simple technical capacities. This is not just about supplies or logistics. This is fundamentally about the fact that the Roman legionnaire, first and foremost, before anything else, is fundamentally an assault engineer, right? The entire Roman citizen force, through essentially like the peak of the so-called imperial period, because it had to grow into something like that, was incredibly engineering minded. This could act, the Romans themselves are the first spreaders of the myth that Rome at some point sprang out of nowhere and copied from others. That, in the sense, Italy was schooled by basically was the student really of any other land around. And this is something that the Romans wanted to point out in particular as a sort of obsequium towards the Greeks, to show them that fundamentally they had learned much from them in order to be able to rule them, which is something that the Greeks very much like as a concept, even when they were basically, in fact, in their own imaginary bubble of freedom, well within, in fact, a Roman domination for centuries and centuries, so much so that, as you know, many of those Greeks eventually turned out to sort of identify as Romans, at least to some degree, because there is always the question of the Byzantines, and that Schwerpunkt, we made more than one video about this specific this specific topic. In any case, I will not digress in the sense of what we mean by Roman here. We're for this video, because we have to. It's already long as it is, and so we have to stick to, again, mostly the basics and the conventional to understand what we're talking about. And of course, I think that rather than logistics, that is probably also underrepresented in pop culture, in particular regarding the Roman army, explaining how these armies worked, I think that it's this military engineering-minded dimension that counts the most. Because, as I was saying before, when you look at the Romans, yes, they topped certain aspects of material culture in the ancient world, to say the least. They were the ones who invested in unprecedented scale in some particular type of constructions. They were aided by Hellenistic engineers. This is true also in the Roman army at some point. Like, the Italics had to use some of these guys. In fact, we've seen how even the first catapults that we can't properly document in history were created by Hellenic engineers, but were employed where? We were in southern Italy, in the Magno-Grecian context, and they were essentially were created by the Greeks, but used by the Romans, right? They were given by the Greeks to the Romans to essentially storm an Italic coastal positions, right? So that tells you, we are in the 4th century BC, how precociously aware and capable of using advanced military technologies the Romans really were. Consider that before that point, as you know also from that video and others, this is notorious, that torsion catapults do not seem to have quite existed in the art of war. The war was incredibly young. The art of war was incredibly primitive, right? That's the same century of Alexander and his hammer and anvil army that had been created, by his father mostly, but that he definitely had more than a chance than properly employing and refining, having its potential literally exploding. But before that, even cavalry as an arm was something fairly recent, like not more than half of a millennium as a fully fledged armory. I'm not talking chariot cavalry proper, but it's just for saying how the Romans gradually expanded in the Mediterranean, where they conquered southern Italy, they conquered Sicily. They later expanded in the 3rd century BC also in Spain. They captured in Carthago Nova an incredibly large amount of torsion catapults of all kinds from the Carthaginians. And so they, at some point, are capable of properly of availing themselves of large amounts of sophisticated engines and to besiege pretty large cities, some of the largest, in fact, of the Mediterranean, such as the same Carthage, was eventually destroyed. So we understand that actually the Romans were quite precocious, and that the entire notion that we're, quote-unquote, military, say, technologically inferior to say, for example, the Carthaginians, just because the Carthaginians had torsion catapults. I mean, the Romans basically created a fleet out of scratch that was able to beat the Carthaginians. let's see, maybe out of scratch is part of the Roman narrative from the later first century BC, etc. The Romans in the Italics had actually a more advanced naval engineering than we normally think, but that's just for saying the Romans may have not had to use that large amount of naval force before, but evidently they already knew how to create one to beat the best sailors out there in Western Mediterranean, if not in the entire Mediterranean, and to basically win also the Punic Wars on the longer run. So there is something that we should very carefully examine this, because we have, yes, the lack of technological means, not because they weren't available. This is the great lesson, that technology is always the great lie. If you want to search for quote unquote great lies in the history of warfare, it's not some ideological whining about war and how it's fought. It is actually about the idea that technology wins war. Right, technology alone is nothing. Doctrine is everything, and especially in the ancient world, if you had seen how scarcely used actual technology was in particularly sophisticated fashion and scale, you would realize instead how much more directly hand-to-hand and aggressive and ad hominem, as the Latins themselves would have said, warfare really was. Right, warfare was and still is technically, regardless of the means, about ripping off the other person's guts, right, and probably being showered in their blood and spilling their guts all over the place, and that's fundamentally war. That's how it's done. Humans are programmed to do this. It's encoded in our genetics in particular circumstances. The Romans definitely knew how to extract the best of that in brutalizing into radically effective discipline. There's still very incredibly individualistically minded Italic warriors from, as we've seen also in the recent video about the Samnites, from the rugged and cold Apenninic hinterlands, and into something that definitely took over the world, and that was to eventually make great and systematized use, as we'll see now, of military engineering, but that you realize in the latter element being essentially a reflection of their own moral, actually spiritual, actually metaphysical understanding of themselves as people that were literally molding the world in their own image. And this is simply confirmed by the fact that whichever place was conquered, the foundation of a new Rome as a heavenly city was carried out to create a unified empire that, as you know, we've seen, this legacy is immense, right? It's at the root of Western civilization, together with other sort of prehistorical strata, including for most Indo-European ethos and sort of conquest, and there are also warlike culture that the Romans were definitely embodying. But that we've seen also in the videos about Montjoie Saint-Denis. We have not been told what even Europe looked like at the time in terms of the unified sense that the Godfather sanctified hilltops of any place, basically, in the land from the Mediterranean to Northern Europe were dotting the entire space, that the way the world was seen was entirely metaphysical in the minds of these peoples, and that therefore also seizing a city. When you read Tacitus, that is also relatively modernized and secularized compared to, I don't know, the Romans, his ancestors of a few hundred years before. The Roman siege of Jerusalem is a metaphysical description. It is, of course, sort of depicting how the siege went on, but the entire point is fundamentally moral. It's fundamentally, here also from the senatorial elite, an incredibly and beautifully primitive idea of conquest and subjugation and dominance and superiority that you have not been taught when, in fact, hearing about the Roman army in school or elsewhere, because it simply did not fit most of the vibes that, unfortunately, in fact, were killed from the same sources after sort of in the last generations, we can actually say, for reasons that are uniquely pertinent to, in fact, the same period and not what the actual Roman world was about. Notoriously, Roman armies marched through enemy territory, entrenched in a camp, allegedly every night, and usually kept one to their rear when giving battle to protect baggage and offer a refuge. All right, this is a very famous notion, and we don't have, of course, it's not just entirely plausible, but it's not something you can falsify, especially because you just have an information from that time, and if you know what that means and how lucky we are to have it to begin with, whatever it is, you have to listen to it very carefully. But even if, as it's likely, obviously, it's not like every single Roman legion would have always built a camp anywhere. So this thing was mostly done in some context for the sake of discipline, of practice. You had properly to learn how to do it. And so this may seem an excessive stretch, but actually it is incredibly useful, because when you're under sort of enemy attacks, we know that these legionnaires were capable of building these camps while properly there was a battle raging, outside of the perimeter, between the sort of, in fact, the main perimeter that was shielding the same other legionaries working with their dolabras, directing the camp under fire. And that, in fact, in enemy land, this would have been normal. Also, in other times in history, you are at a camp. When you march, you must have some sort of protection. At night, you have to be careful. The enemy is obviously going to harass you, to ambush you, or all this kind of stuff. You must have some solid projection, launching pad, and something to fall back on if things go wrong right during the march. And we're talking massive camps. We have a pretty sort of eloquent literature on this. There is a bit that Hellenic schematism regarding the otherwise, in fact, quite detailed, perhaps too detailed or too ideal construction of a Roman legionary fort, like how this looked like. And some of these would become, as you know, the basis of many cities in Europe and in Mediterranean as well. And that we can't, and we also, again, made videos on this, so if you're interested, you can check those out. And that, however, we can't imagine having simply developed over time. Like there is this saying, there are all these adages that are actually stemming from classical anecdotes, such as that the Romans would have allegedly learned how to create, would have learned the art of castrametation from Pyrrhus when he invaded Italy. In the first half of the 3rd century BC, which seems to be a bit too late, right, for an army like the one that the Romans had already become at that point. So it's a mix of sort of half-truths, basically, that in that sense revolve around the fact that the Romans were truly stepping up at that point towards a literally imperial dimension, from a regional basis, starting to rule over other peoples, creating provinces, etc. And so they needed also at the military engineering level a greater capacity to occupy, to maintain, to protect, to defend. And this is something that obviously would never stop doing. There is also the sense that the Greeks would have been worse at making camps, that there was also a more lax discipline, because we have sources, I don't know, like the Code of Amphipolis, that's an Antigone 2nd century BC material, and that does not compare well with later, I don't know, for example, Flavius Josephus's description of the Roman army. Naturally, this is a cliche. We can't think in any serious fashion, I don't know, that Alexander's camps were not well done, or it was something in that sense, even in being centuries of distance in the development of the art of war. It was something, again, specifically structural or categorical about how these peoples eventually built actual military camps. We can think, however, that the Romans, being very aware of the importance of the form, the rigidity of their discipline, being harsher, being more, say, you can't even say iron-fisted, because they had always this dual sense of redemptional worth, of the capacity of, in fact, doing things that actually work, right? Not merely imperare sed regere, they would have said. This is also how Virgil properly see the evangelical mandate of Rome in world domination. there is something definitely about the Roman military that had very much insisted since the beginning, their own sagas and their own self-representation, about this idea that discipline, naturally as a product of the divine mediation of the imperator, of the commander, is in this sense akin to a sacred law, right? That virtue itself has to, obviously, of those who are commanded, must be necessarily complemented by the degree of discipline that is really required. And the Romans would never actually make the degree of the Greeks that, if you read Thucydides, basically conceptualize, and even there it's just Thucydides. It's not necessarily like how even the various sort of Hellenic commanders of the time would have expressed themselves necessarily. But they're, culturally speaking, these are interesting indicators, nevertheless. Believing in that Hellenic instance that discipline could be extended, in this sense, in a rational sense, to an absolute, right? It's basically an Athenian, probably in the sense of Athena, sense of Sophia Perennis. So it's obviously a doctrine of the two natures mentality, where discipline is just basically the instantiation of some actual functionality for winning war, and that can be sublimated to a divine level. The Romans, instead, that had a much more sort of deeper sense of the divine incarnation in a earthly dominion, realized that the theosis itself couldn't but be accomplished by exploiting, by compounding and transcending the elements that created, that made up men per se. And so they would have never extrapolated discipline from virtus, right? Because they understood that staying in line, so to say, is something that must be used in order to sort of give discipline to those, in fact, who lack it at a lower level, whereas the commander must necessarily display some higher divine character, provided that virtus is not an abstract kind of set of moral values, whatever. It's actually, in Latin, the idea of probably what it's warriorhood. It literally means that it's manhood, it's virility, it's warriorhood, and it stemmed from that traumatically brutal tribal warlike background from which the Romans emerged, so much so that the Romans in this sense never stifled, never repressed that level of warlike individualism of their legionnaires to an utmost. Also because they had it available, right? Differently from the Hellenes that had grown a bit more gentrified, but on the contrary encouraged it within, however, the limits of discipline. There's a beautiful passage. We've seen it in many different, this is notorious, anthropologically speaking, you can find so many poignant passages in sort of Roman and, in the sense, also Hellenic literature about the Romans. The outcome, the aftermath of Gergovia against Vercingetorix Rex, where the Roman legionnaires had actually successfully stormed the Gallic fortifications, but they had entered just mostly with this overconfident attitude and sort of started to plunder the oppidum, and sort of growing, so being so exalted to forget discipline. And Caesar, that actually admired that virtue, right? So this warlike character, however, approaches the legionnaire because he had incentivized that. We've seen it also in the battle of Pharsalus. There is he who has the initiative, who has the offense, is the one who is capable, who is expected, at least ideally. This is a concept that also from Clausewitz well explains, of arising to the highest of military virtue, because all the elements of the Clausewitzian trinity must be compounded in order for the offensive to surpass its inherently weak, so disadvantageous essence on to overwhelm the defensive, right? And Caesar says, remember that there is as much merit and value in being able also to respect discipline and to, in the sense, not just act as a superhero, especially if you are really not much of that divine element yet, right? And this is something I really want to make more videos on, because like this, it may sound too abstract, like in kind, but if you read Julius Caesar's, like your works, you realize that as Roman sagas as they were, there was an incredibly deep sense that virtue does not stem merely from some absolute rational rigid discipline per se, but that must be just like the propedeutic basis, launchpad for a divine, properly heroic endeavor that starts from the individual. And if you look at the Roman legionary equipment, you realize that even though incredibly well disciplined, they were not at all conceived to simply fight in rigidly, thickly packed formations, as sometimes we like to describe it. Also because this gets often debated, as we've seen also in the other videos, the arrays, how big the formations really were, how much space between the soldiers. These are the things that notoriously every person who has an elementary knowledge of the sources like knows that it's not known. All right, we have two different ideas, one from Polybius, one from Vegetius, according to which basically we aside from the different time in history that you can't simply say, oh well, that's because they had changed over time, because it could still happen. It still happens in every formation. Every army is different. Every commander will ask something different. Every unit is different. Polybius basically speaks of a sort of open order, whereas Vegetius of a phalanx de facto. So there is a lot about the ways you can eventually sort of sort these things out if you abandon some rigid schematism and work gamistic, but it's actually this distance and size. That's not how ancient warfare, or warfare to begin with, work, right? Back to our Roman camp, they normally feature a ditch with the spoil piled into a bank behind it. Each soldier planted on this bank the stake he had carried. The Romans were overly loaded with tens and tens and tens of kilos, right? That we know of are the soldiers in history that carried the heaviest level of equipment on a regular basis. It was something terrifying, right? You have to appreciate how sturdy. You can't imagine like the peasant stocks of the ancient world, like what they look like as human types as well to withstand this periodic strains, right? And in fact, the stakes have a specific meaning, that is the pila muralia, because they literally were the pila, so this idea, the stick, the pilum is therefore like a lance, a spear if you want, and that, however, are properly the wall ones, the ones that eventually you fix on the ground to create a wall, right? They were pointed at both ends and narrowed. It is a bit like the Frisian horses, right? Fortification, and narrowed in the middle to allow lashing together. And these things were crucial because alone they added an enormous weight on the legionnaire on top of all what they had in relative terms, but they were so necessary to better defend the camp and to basically break enemy attacks, charges, whatsoever, and they were incredibly important, as much as the dolabra pickaxes that worked basically as a sort of universal tool for building, destroying, even fighting in certain circumstances, including against other well-armored Roman legionnaires. The pila muralia could also serve as missiles in more permanent works, which is sort of fascinating if you think about the concept. This practice probably accounts for descriptions of a legionary. We will talk about this, how much they actually carried and so on, carrying two pila, one thick and one thin, right? And this doesn't have to be confused either with the fact that legionnaires literally called, their heavy javelins were basically designed in a similar way, in the sense that there was a heavier and a lighter one. They were modular to the normal sort of distances and two shots that they had before charging into the enemy, right, to maximize the impact. In any case, the Roman camp gateways were protected by an angled protrusion or detached ditch section that forced attackers into a double turn, exposing their flanks to missiles and breaking their momentum. If, of course, we assume that this was somehow standardized, which wasn't. Again, this depends on the terrain, depends on how much time you had to build, whatever. So here we're just discussing a stereotypical Roman camp, but in this sense, don't think that the Romans could and would always build the same identical thing, because they may have simply not have the chance at a certain point. Broad streets connected the leather tents inside. Again, I made some pretty detailed videos about how the entire zones and spaces were organized there for obvious functionality, redeployment, salaries, sort of probably getting out and deploy. There's an interesting logic and function that you want to appreciate. Contrary to long-standing opinion, ramparts and ditches were not leveled when the army departed, or at least seems in most cases, because many such earthworks remain visible today, and in any case they could be used, especially in many circumstances where the Romans had come to fight more or less in the same areas. It wasn't this or that sort of rampart and ditch system that simply conferred too many advantages. It was an idea of sort of a Roman brand, right, on as we've seen the world, and something that could still be partly reused, because the location was never random. By the way, if they had to come back fighting there for some reason, they would have had a specific advantage that normally, considering that the enemies came from other places, would have not existed quite in the same fashion. And this actually is very well known if you look at modern fortifications, say contemporary fortifications, and how they can be functional always. Everything can acquire strategic relevance, but obviously if a fortificatory system is oriented towards a certain direction of defending or offending, it makes a difference for the sides, and it's unlikely that simply the same side will fundamentally come from the same exact direction of the former enemy at a point. Permanent forts followed a broadly similar plan, but were generally much smaller as well. In certain circumstances, ditches were deeper and could be doubled or tripled. Ramparts were taller, often built of turf blocks and crowned with a wooden palisade. Wooden towers strengthened corners and gateways. Tents gave way to wooden buildings. Fort sites were chosen primarily for control of communications rather than pure defensive strength. So it's always a matter of what was this fort functional to, right? Because at some point there were bigger cities, and some of the cities, as we were saying before, had actually emerged from non-permanent, at least initially, not necessarily permanent camps. We would kind of become that, whereas these other fort sites were sort of more scientifically established to control a perimeter, but in fact were not really meant to be so central. And there are all sorts of in-between, right? The Romans themselves had different terms for fortifications, or at least strongholds and fortified emplacements. Arcs, that was mostly like the fortified hilltop. The oppidum, that was something similar, but let's say more tendentially, more comprehensive. The arcs is normally just a citadel, right? Originally, same Arx Capitolina is the fortified hilltop capital in hill, whereas the oppidum would have contained an arx, like a citadel, as also a sacred place, but it was more like the wall system of fortification. You had the castrum itself that referred to these military encampments established like that. There was the castellum at some point as well. There were smaller forts. So you find in Latin as well, and also in Middle Latin, because this continues in the Middle Ages. I don't think in the sense that forts were overly different historically in different ages across the time. You don't often hear of medieval camps, but they were pretty impressive things. At some point, I know that because I've been researching this as well, like medievals were self-aware of the dimensions of Roman camps and how they had fundamentally surpassed them at a certain point or in certain cases. Fort sites were chosen primarily for control of communications rather than pure defensive strength, as you understand. Everything has a strategic value that changes depending, especially on manpower, of the broader sort of goal of why those troops are there to begin with. And so you can have some forts that are in certain circumstances useless and others that acquire much greater importance regardless of size. We have to talk more about von Clausewitz again, by the way. Unless outnumbered overwhelmingly, garrisons were expected to fight outside the fort, so multiple gates allowed rapid deployment as well. This obviously if they were enough to fence off a specific threat. This was kind of normal, at least the idea that frontier warfare entails a lot of expeditions around. Imagine a Far West situation, like I'm preparing a video on that too, sort of. And you always have to chase these mortiers, you have to go out there. There are also some more immediately tactically expandable sallies that maybe to break a siege at night of the same, devastating the enemy machines or whatever. There are all kinds of siege contexts. We have to talk more about siege warfare and Schwerpunkt throughout all eras because they may sound less sort of attractive and entertaining, so to say, than open field engagements in a military historical sense, but actually they are also quite connected with the same. As you know, most battles were also fought basically over a siege, trying to break it, and so giving battle in open field. Over time, many forts were rebuilt in stone as well, and in fact you have great amount of sort of vestiges in this sense on the Roman frontiers. Think about the Porta Nigra in Trier that became also at some point the headquarters for Napoleon in the 19th century. Cities and towns were frequently defended by walls. In the later empire, strong stone curtain walls with fortified gateways projecting towers and ditches became nearly universal. This would be the more commonly called castella, so to say, which we also discussed in some recent videos about, for example, Western Frankish fortifications from Clovis onwards to William the Conqueror, but that well overlaps with a video that I made about the Roman legacy in Merovingian warfare that mostly revolves around fortifications of cities, of other castles, and so on. That gets often overlooked because, as we were also hinting at before, we tend not probably to imagine, or at least we're not normally presented with the idea that ancient, medieval, and part also modern Europe was dotted with an enormous amount of fortifications. This is something you don't see in the contemporary world because the art of war has sort of surpassed these things. There are obviously quite heavily fortified borders, frontiers. Think about Ukraine right now. So you have the capacity of building fortifications, etc. But let's say at the time, like these fortifications were ubiquitous, right? They were everywhere, and they were not just incredibly functional, but in this sense interspersed. There was essentially the norm. I can think about my 13th, 14th century, like one castle every square kilometers. So we don't have to think about castles that, in fact, we mostly think of today because most of those who are left are the bigger ones, right? So lots of smaller structures that were, however, incredibly effective in so many ways, and especially in later antiquity, the idea is that there are more forts, especially with barbarian invasions and the permeability of the frontier, etc., that brings to the so-called idea of defense in depth that technically was always there, also in the previous centuries, but with a greater degree probably of fortified buildings that had not existed for the sake of direct defense. So because there were actual invasions, it wasn't just let's see what to do behind the lines. No, there were actual war bands forming around it. We don't kind of get this also as far as the previous period. This was the case in pre-Roman Europe largely. That's where the Celts lived, where the Germans lived, with the same Romans had emerged from their Latin and Italic background. So in part, Rome had pacified this world, rendering heavy fortification also unnecessary. For centuries, we've seen how the Oppida were dismissed, or how properly Roman cities are built in the open ground, in the lowlands, simply because there are less threats, right? It's not like these places are not fortified themselves or that there aren't fortifications around, but it's the entire political geography of this territorial domination that changes how properly and where people live, as a matter of fact. Substantial portions of these fortifications survived to be notoriously incorporated into medieval fortifications and can still be seen. Some important cities had multiple concentric rings of defenses, which is something that you normally see in Europe only starting from the High Middle Ages, again, with 3 or 4 even, outside of the Roman one, just for telling you also how big, for example, medieval urbanism really was. It doesn't get enough credit. Frontier garrison towns sometimes featured an internal military quarter walled off civilian areas, right? In other words, there was already some sort of local settlement, and can be also a big one, like there were actual cities, obviously, out there. And the Romans initially settled outside, right? And they lived their lives of soldiers, also separated from civilians, which naturally was very important. Even though they participated to the local communities, they organized games, they built arenas outside for entertainment, and so there was all kind of gradual mingling with the population or the generations. Defensive artillery was usually concentrated in towers, which was effective against other artillery mostly, and also for smashing enemy troops, but mostly in fact for destroying enemy siege machinery, right? Because if you want to destroy enemy troops, javelins, arrows, stones are sort of the best thing universally. We have really to make a more and better videos about the function and purpose of artillery in antiquity, because that gets often there is, you see why I hate modern historiography. There is this is admittedly about medieval warfare, but a relatively famous scholar published an article called like catapults weren't cannons, or weren't, I don't know how it was talking about, like some sort of device, explosive device or whatever from later modern warfare. Like, do we need even scholarship to get so low in order to conceptually explain what could be in fact expressed in a much more concrete and sophisticated way? This is basically saying whoever is reading is dumb, or at least you want to provoke him. There's really no reason for those fireworks. But that's unfortunately also how publishing works nowadays. During the later empire, field army units were commonly billeted on city householders in peacetime rather than kept in separate fronts, right? This actually depended not much on the contingencies of the late Roman period that witnessed, of course, like as we've said before, increased fortifications, communities needed more local protection. This is something that happened also in other times in history within also same national boundaries, right? But there is 2 considerations. First of all, the Romans had, as we've seen, began as conquerors, and so they were something separated from the local population. At this point, they are something much more, and they wanted to be separated from it originally, because they truly were a different people. They were a sanctified people by the conquest, and so the others were their subjects, and they didn't have the same privilege and honor even of bearing arms and of having that specific. The Roman identity revolved around bearing arms fundamentally as freemen and therefore noblemen in arms. That's the most pristine concept of freedom, right? Also in Indo-European mentality, and in this great hierarchy that the Romans had established by conquering the world. The other aspect is that in later antiquity, however, everybody was kind of a Roman as well, and so there was a difference between the military and civilians, right? It will become a bit more blurred in the Middle Ages, but that was also kind of blurred at least by our own contemporary standards of separation between military and civilian, right? The soldier was, for example, mostly recognized by the cingulum militaris. It's probably the right of bearing arms, which is something very different from today's concept of who can bear arms and in which context, right? Even across cultures that are either restrictive or permissive about it. And so it's a completely different way of seeing the world, telling the truth, for everybody involved. This change towards the later empire freed more troops for active service by removing the need to leave detachments guarding bases while daily training parades continued. Naturally, you're aware of the limitane/ripenses, and so the idea that the Roman military was, due to social stratification, is becoming more hierarchical, and so there were proper field armies that were more functional for proper campaigning and so on, and a great deal of essential levy militia in the form of these local soldiers that for a while were still conceived in the wake of this great imperial tradition as being soldiers and being there properly as units and something separated from like merely, okay, you're a freeman and at some point you have to be levied because you live there. No, they thought of themselves as soldiers, but as you know, towards the later period, this difference somehow waned, and indeed, the Limitani were gradually sort of giving way to probably a different type of military organization with the rise, probably the surpassing of cavalry or infantry. It's a social cultural background was completely redrawn towards the later migration era that we're talking, say, essentially the early Middle Ages. At that point, I will make more videos about this. So I hope that this gives you a broad idea. And as you know, I recently began to talk a bit more about castles, about fortifications. I find, again, the continuum also from antiquity into the Middle Ages quite fascinating, especially in Southern Europe. That gets a bit like, from a military point of view, especially not particularly popularized. And instead, that's really eye-opening. Also, at a strictly archaeological level, not just from a military standpoint. Like, we think that there were cities that literally rose and fell from late antiquity to the early Middle Ages. That's some sort. We're talking several centuries in between that we haven't even conceptualized as an actual era where these things were happening. Definitely, this was not much happening in Northern Europe. That would remain obviously backwards from a material point of view from quite a time. So there is also less to dig there. But as you know, considering what we said, that think about all the oppida that covered great swathes of Western Europe and beyond, like, there's probably always, if you look at European history everywhere, regardless of concentration, just not enough financial resources to have anything near to completion or possible completion, right, in terms of digging, etc. And not really a fan of how archaeological business is made, and I will probably be polemically vocal about this at some point more and better. But let's pass now to strategy, because it is largely what we're discussing today. We could even open another, I don't know whether this is probably already more than an hour long, but just for telling you how I do things on Schwerpunkt. And this may be still like a fair of cliches, so let's try to make it in a way that at least makes sense by approximation. Because you can't talk strategy if you don't talk politics, and so I will try not to digress as much to prevent like this video going beyond the fixed time, and so needing a fourth video for that matter. So some say that late Republican, first of all, allowed the simplification of Republican period. It was never such a thing. Like, there was never like properly an imperial period. We talk about different things from oligarchy to monarchy if you want, but that's also a relative approximation. There are so many different substages, but you know what we're talking about. Late Republican strategy, what we're seeing, we're starting with chronologically with this video, with this episode's sort of purpose, was described at some point, like in modern historiography, as opportune meddling. Like the Senate or one of its appointees would intervene in a foreign state's affairs with their own private means and sort of lawful mandate alike. This is the age of so-called warlords. This is an idea that's been gradually sort of reduced because historiography essentially tended to claim that was a radical recruitment shortage in the mid-2nd century. And when you look at the same Gracchus society and all the agrarian issues that existed, definitely were political, were civic. Yes, there were some problems in that kind, but they were mostly, in fact, not due to scarcity of manpower, or even like in actual military terms. Like, it's not like Rome ever ran out of men or something like this, even in recruitment capacity. Equally, the notion that everything was simply taken over by some major magnates and warlords in late Republican times is also being relatively reduced. It was still a functional senatorial system, at least until the mid first century BC, and largely even the failure of the Senate to maintain control did not immediately equate just to some sort of mere oligarch that controls everything just per se. Clientels were still part of a Roman civic political institutional system, and things were a bit more complicated than this. So we'll have to talk about this better. But when told to mind its own business at this point, Rome essentially would claim her honor had been impugned, leading to a brisk war that typically left her zone of influence enlarged. Right, this was actually a pretty messy time, especially from the in terms of continuous warfare, practically on many fronts, from the essentially the Numidian War up to, in fact, the civil wars. Like, there is hardly in the previous generations there have been probably moments of peace. Yes, there had been moments or campaigns here and there at the provincial level. Nothing was ever fully pacified, but the level of direct involvement with literal civil wars on the same Italian soil, the servile revolts, major uprising against the Romans, say in Pontus, even somebody like Sertorius that could, as a Roman and as a relic of the Marian faction in Spain, like raised with local power to fight against. But this is something continuous, somehow insane. You have at the same time, in fact, Sertorius, Spartacus, and Mithridates at a point fighting against Rome. What you want to appreciate as well is that none of this went anywhere. I mean, it's obvious that the Roman system had some problem at that point, but whichever that problem was definitely not lacking power and capacity of crushing these revolts. There were some literal solo. Think about Lucullus against Armenia. This guy was left on its own in Bithynia, began to carry out this campaign. So it's an incredibly fascinating time. I would really like to cover it more because it really shows you how sort of feudal and vassalatic the system really was. That's a way of seeing Rome that we should actually come back to appreciate. That Rome was a big feudal system after all in her imperial dominance. New territory might be governed directly or left under a client ruler supported by Rome, which is also kind of obvious if you have a puppet state with a local monarchy or whichever system that in any case is aligned with Rome, lets sort of trade work smoothly, pays its own due, maybe also helps you with men and resources. Like, yeah, it works. It really obviously derives from the fact that Rome is politically, morally, and strategically hegemonic for quite a while, having broken the reins of the major Diadochoi powers, and so reducing the rest of the Mediterranean, and therefore all the peoples who gravitated around it to a condition of vassalage, right? It could be messy because Rome had not yet fully occupied, or at least had, in fact, that's where the so-called recruitment crisis comes into play. Like, Rome had not, for a while, they had also been stationary, like the destruction of Carthage and Corinth in particular were a bit of sort of coming as a Roman signal of, like, we don't care about anything and anyone. If you try to rebel against us, we're going to raise you to the ground. We don't care even about the aforementioned obsequium towards the Greeks. People were really traumatized by the sack of Corinth, but the one of Carthage was, relatively irrelevant. But there was a deep moral point to this, like the shock effect, as with Roman deterrence, was very much out there. But in this sense, Rome, basically, if you look at the geography of it as well, Rome basically is just aiming at this point at controlling the Mediterranean. They haven't even properly vied yet for a properly continental European policy. You have to wait Caesar and Augustus launching and stabilizing this respectively, with also further invasions, obviously. And this is valid for every different chunk. If you look at every region, we've also launched a series on the Roman conquest of Spain. It, as you know, was very gradual, mostly revolved around controlling the most important Mediterranean coastland and sort of mostly having to deal with disturbances of peoples from the hinterland that never sort of even posed a threat properly. This is important to stress to Roman presence, right? Barbarian peoples did not have the capacity to dislodge Rome from their strongholds. And this is, in fact, very important. It speaks also of divide of civilizational scale. So Rome can afford, by a degree, with this prorompent conquest, to simply say, to simply intimidate these other countries into subjection, avoiding also direct occupation that was humiliating and mostly, in fact, the result of some previous contrast with Rome. This, however, is messy. Rome still controls different provinces, sends, as you know, some magistrates and agents that fundamentally tend to exploit very much local resources, cause problems in the same uprisings, and so on. And this because the Senate does not have a unified, singular control or command. You really have to await the Principate to have sort of more unitary direction. And so the whole picture is basically some Roman coastal occupation that can bring also to some expeditions in the hinterland at most, but only gradually subjecting various territories, very sort of layer by layer of defense in fortification that will eventually create the Roman Empire. And as you know, there is also, again, a cultural geography where really, like, some places can properly sustain a certain level of also military presence, others simply can't because there aren't resources. So Rome very much builds very gradually her empire. The aforementioned client kings face constant interference in an uncertain future as well. Eventually, a successor would fail to master the required balance of subservience, and the kingdom would be absorbed as a province. This could happen because, I don't know, there was a civil war in it. Think about Egypt, that also had a monstrous public debt that eventually brought the country to simply be bought by Rome, to fall into its hands. At point, again, there were tribes that had been more or less dwelling in the vicinities of Roman territories that sort of, were another a bit by need of resources and plunder, a bit because Rome simply is blackmailing them into subservience, like got war with Rome and obviously got crushed. It's not like Rome did not bleed throughout all this. In fact, it's quite fascinating to see how many resources Rome did actually commit to control these peoples, but at large, it's also a pretty sort of if you zooming out, it's a pretty extraordinary display of deterrent force and very ad hoc military interventions that, for how costly they could be and bloody they could be, do not match, in fact, the level of conquest that Rome successfully achieves, and the level of also at some point of destruction, of displacement, of massacre of different peoples that literally have to change home. We've seen this for videos like, I don't know, this Kordiski. We've seen it for the this happened also at the hands of other peoples, right? And Rome plays in all this, as we've seen also recently with some videos about the Germans. Like, the notion that these people sort of just met at a certain point is ridiculous. All these Europeans knew each other, like they constantly traded with each other from millennia. They didn't have really any doubt about who they were, how they were. Obviously, more direct involvement is a different story. Definitely, while movement is probably human mobility is heavily underrated in history, indeed, polities in this late Iron Age period are definitely something a bit more on their own when distances are involved, etc. So direct involvement is also something else. And you have this incredible Roman will to power, even in moments of crisis. If you think about Spain, the Romans spent centuries before fully committing and conquering, not because they didn't have resources, but literally they didn't care. They could control the coastal areas and it's done. Like what can simply the Lusitanians do, so to say. Same goes for the Numidians. The Numidians had started creating problems in a sort of, in that sense, underrated quadrant of Roman interference. The Romans did not think of Numidia much. They saw it as a particularly distant, also culturally distant world. They did not want to be committed, but there you have the rise of Marius and actually of Sulla under him. In that instance, we still haven't made a video about the Numidian War and also the initial Numidian involvement in Roman affairs that had served under the Romans in Spain for notoriously. So with Jugurtha and so on. So it's a very complex picture. the Romans used Numidian elephants against the Macedons, interestingly, in Greece during the Macedonian Wars proper. So it's at Kynoskephalae, there were also at Pydna. So you have really a very interesting level of Roman power projection that we tend perhaps to sectorialize because we know less from that world other than what the great classical names tell us. But it's say if this had been medieval times, we would know how many Romans could have been found up to places like, I don't know, Guinea or India, the Malabar Temple of Augustus later is a remote in China. So this was actually a much more open world. Just we know a bit less regarding this work. Remember, more primitive does not necessarily mean that people did not move or did not travel at all. There's a bit of the bias that in the Middle Ages they wouldn't, in Antiquity they would, but that's also not quite correct. It's also a matter of documentation at a point. How much do we actually know in detail about warfare? We were talking about this in the first video of this episode, meaning, why do we think that, I don't know, the Greeks and the Romans were all about big pitched battles, and why do we think that, I don't know, siege warfare was not as important as it would be in the Middle Ages? There are some reasons why we think that, but it's also because literally so some objective strategic ones, but it's also because classical sources really did not talk more than much about smaller engagements, or we decided not to talk about them as much as sort of the more tendentially national history of different kingdoms would eventually produce an historiography about the Middle Ages. So it's a bit complicated. While they existed, the client states proved real benefits. The king guarded his own borders and thus Rome's, allowing the Romans to avoid permanent border garrisons and instead maintain only a small mobile force nearby to keep the ruler compliant. These client kingdoms acted as buffer states, often in regions like the Levant, North Africa, or parts of Gaul and Britain, as they were being conquered, helping secure frontiers with minimal direct troop commitment. And this is what gradually changes, as we were hinting at already in the early empire. I think this had already been the case with Roman expansion from central Italy throughout the Apennine Peninsula and the surrounding islands, etc. So this is I think, important when we talk about also changes that occurred in late antiquity that very often look like, there were so many barbarians in the army. If you look at the Roman army, that had always been as many Roman citizens as auxiliaries, as a matter of fact, as allies and so on. And so that's not an institutional structuralistic history. It's a history of politics, a history of morality, it's a history of culture, rather. And also, we have to be careful about even thinking that there is probably a Romanity that simply ends just because there is an institution called the empire that calls itself like that. It's a much deeper thing that we shouldn't be reading merely in a sort of 19th, 20th century mentality. It's not really that helpful. I don't mention 21st century mentality because it does not exist, as a matter of fact, together with historical awareness, right? So naturally, in simplifying for the sake of the video, that is, again, particularly long, but some scholars, let's put it this way, spotted the chief innovation, this system in the early empire, where far greater political concentration was achieved. All right. So first of all, we all know what happened actually in between, namely the Marian reforms, and so not just a real sort of fracture with what had happened before. What we speak of the Marian reforms achieved basically was already achieved in the moment in which they were established. Actually, that's why they're established. They're also mostly a political reform. It's not like they literally changed the army or as such. Things just came out of changes came from whom could be enlisted and with which sort of ease and with which means and so on. So actually Rome had been growing and compact, and it was obvious that the way, right, the simpler more primitive way, to which we invest the Senate with this idea of, my God, it works so much. It was a bit like our Republican values as opposed to some sort of monarchic tyranny or whatever came later. No, there is also a massive stepping up in the actual capacity of control, on the actual prosperity of the empire. It's basically under the Antonines that sort of you could live best as a Roman, at least if we look at material availability, probably per capita wealth. And it would take a long time before, Italians in that case could live better. They had remained actually the richest per capita, but it's been calculated just like towards the beginning of the 14th century, this could be reachieved. So even in previous times, you can argue, obviously, from a sort of spiritual, cultural point of view, that the early Rome was better, sort of politically, ethnically, and so on. But this is debatable. This is not really what we're looking at today, per se. I may even agree with that. I have no problem, depending on what we want to discuss. As you know, made lots of videos about this, also in function of the later spread of Christianity, but also what was the previous view of the world. We talked about the Pelasgian world as opposed to the Indo-European one. And so there is a lot actually going on within Rome in that also very self-aware relation with the Orient, as it had been conquered and now was spreading a sort of a different mentality, and which Europeans came more osmotically into direct contact, so to say. And it also partially created our world. But we should also realize how unique that Western identity already was and would remain still to this day, with, in fact, a further galvanization throughout the millennia and in very unique ways that sort of remain fundamentally separated from probably a Levantine world, regardless of the exchanges regarding of the overlappings and so on. So in the early empire, with the Principate, you have the emperor alone deciding on war or peace. This is also debatable because the Senate was there for a reason. There was an establishment. Essentially, the Augustan reforms had parceled, as you know, the empire out, with distributing some provinces, the richest, the less militarized, at the same time, to the senators that could therefore grow their latifundia and participate in this massive intercontinental trade and Mediterranean routes with all their wealth and so on. And then some more militarized, strategically relevant provinces where, in fact, the legions were stationed at large and that were loyal in this sense to the emperor. The only exception in this was Egypt, because Egypt was so crucial, also in terms of resources, of grain, etc., for Rome, that, as you know, Augustus has it run by a prefect with very specific, a Western rank with very specific ties also directly to the emperor. So I made multiple videos about this. This is notorious ABC Roman manualistic history. But you understand how the system also could work that well, and this could have not been achieved in just say, I don't know, a century before. You needed the civil wars, you needed the resettlement, so many power balances within the empire, and it would be matter just for tens of other videos to properly explain how it happened. We have really hundreds of videos on Roman history, but we couldn't obviously cover all immediately, and we can't go fairly in depth, as you know, as well. A governor who launched aggressive campaigns for personal aggrandizement did so at the risk of his life. The emperor did not want that, right? So there was actually a great autonomy in local governmental matters. When we look at the Roman Empire, actually the same peoples the Romans had conquered and gradually Romanized were still essentially seeing themselves as different peoples that had their own role and importance in the empire that they wanted to largely preserve as it continued throughout all antiquity, right? So also the myth that the Romans had been there sort of oppressing these populations that would have allegedly waited for some fellow barbarian tribesmen to liberate them is, I unfortunately encountered this online, and it's sort of as disturbing, as historically nonsensical as it sounds. Also because, again, the divide between these areas was staggering in terms of civilizational development, to say the least. And also what happens later, in fact, with the Germanic migrations at large into the western part of the empire, is fundamentally like an installment to keep as much as possible Roman civilization alive in a moment of great crisis for both involved, and giving, in fact, rise to some of the greatest civilizational alchemies, so to say, in the history of mankind, of which we are also, in fact, direct descendants. When you look at the early empire, you can argue that territorial growth became rare and usually responded to repeated external threats. This is not true if you realize the extent of continental expansion of Rome, especially in Europe, right? And the increasing capacity in this sense to mold the continent as something that would remain deeply connected with Romanity to begin with, right? Romanity is not really preserved in the Levant, is not really preserved in North Africa down the line. Yes, because the Muslims take over, you can argue that the Eastern Roman Empire could have maintained those territories. But this is the point, and we talk about this exactly from early imperial sources, also from Christian apologists that were denouncing the state of Eastern churches and pointing out some sort of greater multicultural fracture in that world that would not cohesively sustain or orderly maintain, by the way, an important organization. In fact, what we tend not to fully appreciate is how increasingly European the empire was, and how the East was always very distant from the models of Romanization that we intend, right? Say Syria or Palestine or Egypt were never Romanized to the extent Spain, Gaul, or to an extent even parts of Britain and Germany really were, right? The what survives also in the Middle Ages as a Roman legacy, something much more cohesively consistent than what we can see even in other forms of government, namely Christian ones, that had also, in fact, been evangelized at the time of, in fact, the empire, from the empire, right? The first actual kingdom, Christian kingdom in history was Armenia, but you have also the Coptic Church, you have the Ethiopians that were also essentially outside the empire. But again, for telling you how you can't simply look at a Roman legacy in the form of some standard badge or tag whereby either you're in or out. This already was seen as the broader spectrum of an imperial Catholic rule of metaphysical standards that were substantiated in the capacity, in fact, to imperially lord over the world itself, right? So that's why it's also quite fascinating to see what kind of empire remain, what kind of proper Romanity and Roman Empire remained in the Middle Ages, in which forms, right? And this is definitely the channel that you were seeking if you're particularly interested in this topic, right? I also made videos about the Dacian Wars, for example, so for the campaign series. So if you're interested in examples of this expansion, you can check that out. I created also one about Roman Britain. Surviving client kingdoms were gradually absorbed, both because they have been heavily sort of destructed over time, but also as frontier areas, so where warfare was waged. We also made videos about sort of Parthian campaigns at Similia, but also because in this sense, Rome was so powerful, right? The Romans really gather an amount of wealth by Augustus' times that had never been seen in the hands of Alexander, right? After the conquest of the Achaemenid Empire. And so, to an extent, like the Roman military with their legionary and auxiliary forces is definitely well apt to simply march in and still fundamentally be temporarily supported by local governments, because they do not really disappear overnight, right? Some places obviously become Roman provinces, but even there was obviously, like in all traditional society, like autonomous communities with their own customs that the Romans simply lorded over. So that's why I was saying before, this was a great feudal system. It was functioning essentially in the same ways. Eventually, medieval law would work, and we don't appreciate this enough, how actually decentralized the Roman Empire factually was, even when it was directly occupied, where it was probably Roman. The local inhabitants were Romanized, Roman citizens, and we will, for this reason, I said at the beginning, need to make much more Roman history explaining why it is so important and how much we have been wrongly sort of proposed in some ways. So frontiers were largely defined by natural features such as obviously major rivers or mountain chains. There were also artificial barriers. At this point, continuous walls with ditches and palisades or chains of posts. This could vary a lot and were always there. Again, this is not just like the Romans building, erecting them, but also exploiting previous fortifications. These places had historically all fortified in some way. The Romans just reinforced the trend gradually, just by being there, by staying there, by improving local defenses. The provinces, their governors were obviously very self-aware about this. They pushed, think about during the 3rd century crisis, for more autonomy. For example, think about the Empire of the Gauls. They were not a secessionistic force like the Palmyrene Empire. It was really something alien to humanity. They were essentially saying, Roman Gauls saying, we want now to be more autonomous to directly deal with the threats on the eastern frontier, right, from the Germans most. So it still worked in full continuity with Romanity. In fact, Gaul will remain a marvel of Romanization throughout late antiquity, the early Middle Ages and beyond. Auxiliary forts defended these boundaries. Their garrisons conducted regular patrols as far forward as practicable and launched offensive actions against incursions. This happens throughout all frontier warfare. Again, just today I was collecting photos of the U.S., the 10th regiments of the U.S. cavalry at the time of the Indian Wars between 1865, say, and 1890. And you see there that next to the Americans, there aren't just other auxiliaries, quote unquote, so to say, sort of the freed blacks after the Civil War, but the same Indians, right, that are themselves mostly scouts, they know better the land, etc. So what happens with the Roman frontier? It's basically the same, right? The legions were held further back in reserve and committed only against major threats. What we tend to underestimate about the legions is how much they actually controlled by sheer deterrence, right? The fact it was, the Rhine or the Danube does not mean that there was a Roman world from this side, and from the other side it was just the darkness. Like, the Romans effectively controlled hundreds of kilometers in those. And when you look at how from the outer side, so to say, and when in fact you look at how the Romans really posited themselves, I made some videos about Roman strategy already, realized that these legions were conceived since Augustus' times as fully capable of springing forth as they did, as we are finding out that Central Europe was much more frequently visited by the Romans than we previously thought, also thanks to archaeological finds of actual forts and so on. Even we've seen Maximinus Thrax winning a victory in northern Germany in the midst of the 3rd century crisis. So just for saying how really obvious it would be for a military of that kind to be able to push across this outer frontier. And we'll return on the way we see this quote-unquote limes, that in fact was not even properly used by the Romans as a term. They preferred munimentum, which means probably like some kind of ammo, right? The idea that they were there, loaded and ready to spring forward, locked and loaded, so to say. Deeper in the interior, the empire's heartlands held almost no troops, except the emperor's guards at Rome. There were actually some allies, there were some legions, as a matter of fact, and there was also disproportion, as you know, probably in the level of frontier garrisoning. You understand that the much more warlike Europe was more controlled by a massive deployment along the Rhine and the Danube, whereas the North African frontier with, as you know, just desertic interland, was held by just one legion, really. So there was also, Egypt was fairly safe. There were issues up Nile, but just like in the East, like the Parthian threat, the Persian attempts at hegemonizing the Levant were conspicuously failing throughout history. That is something which also later on, like de facto, would never be achieved, even when the Sasanians could launch deeper raids, even up to Constantinople, in besieging it later. Here it's outside even our our timeline, but in general, there is a realization, and especially probably in the early imperial period, Rome was not just unchallenged, but so we can't say unchallengeable, but by conventional political and strategical capacity, no people had the capacity to threaten the Roman political territorial extension, like from Scotland to the Persian Gulf. The Romans were pretty hegemonic and clearly the most advanced military, the strongest power. We really have to appreciate this as a Western civilization, but also for what this means at a really big scale. Like, it's obvious that many people feel dispossessed nowadays, and that the sense of, again, the West being vituperated by propaganda, by sort of Marxist Islamist combination, which tells all about this thing, is more like inconsequential than we think. It's mostly like as Westerners that by switching probably our awareness on, like we immediately get back to hegemony, right? So it's something that we have to evaluate within ourselves primarily. But Romanity, in this sense, is something that goes a bit beyond some sort of political or national or territorial belonging. This is something ecumenic. It's something metaphysical. It's something divine. That's how the Romans, also from a deeply genetical and in this sense also identitary and absolutely sort of truly Roman sense, they saw as central and crucial. This was done by a people. Another tendency that we have to think Romanity is as if, every single people the Romans conquered existed, but the Romans are sort of just the Romans. No, this was basically the Italics, right? There is no other way to see this. And it was insane and unrepeated in history. No other people fundamentally did this. If you look at also other basins of major civilizations before Rome, these were basically just dwelling within their own boundaries, all right? There were exceptions to this, but the empires were never so cohesive, homogeneous as the Roman one, as far as, in fact, their metaphysical capacity to redeem and augment the world really were concerned. So I have lots of videos about tradition, about, in this sense, ancient spirituality. It was all about that, and Rome truly marks a series of sort of universal eras, right? This is not just about the world. This is not just about Western Eurasia, the Mediterranean. This is about something much greater that transcends the earth as such. There were, for these reasons, for example, no clear successory rules. An unpopular emperor or one who died without a clear heir often faced frontier commanders marching on the capital to contest the succession, because it was about who held power objectively. And still, the Romans, in spite of all their internal strifes, sort of lasted particularly long, right? There wasn't a moment where, yes, there were some revolts. Think about Civilis that exploited the year of the four emperors, all these kind of events. Of course, as the empire is fragile, others profit of that. But if you look at it in a bigger picture, it's not until the 3rd century that this problem presents itself at a meaningful scale. Basically, you have the system basically restored within a few decades. That obviously should make you stress the continuity with the previous system, and it goes on for other hundreds of years, even longer than from the time of Augustus. Obviously, before Augustus, there had already been a Roman Empire, but this is much longer than we commonly think. Right, we do not seem to be so obsessed, for example, as for the Byzantines, saying, "Oh, look at how much they lasted, how long this is." Because they all account like this the implication is that this is Rome, right? But it's actually the Byzantines. And nobody focuses so much about the longevity of Rome as such, also in the previous centuries, per se, which is actually even more unique in the way it manifested, right? Byzantine history emerged in a moment in which that original unity and continuity had actually been shrinking in many ways. And other actors were also capable of sort of competing or integrating this system, or sort of trying to prop up the idea of an ecumenic empire that was surely deserved. But if you look at the Holy Roman Empire, it was actually the Roman Empire itself, just like the Byzantine one was really. But at that point, you have to enter more in the theology of it and how they thought of it at the time, rather than saying, "Oh no, that's not actually the Roman Empire either. They were fictitious one." No, they actually thought that they were sort of maintaining or reactivating the Roman Empire. There are some moments of peaks in the medieval West where you could actually, in the 13th century, say that there was a renewed and even sort of extended hegemony of Rome in some way. So in any case, I will make more videos about this, because literally the rulers of the time said it, right? And not somebody on X that writes down comments just to attract subscribers. That there is a staggering difference between the two. And so again, we're skipping some of the most crucial aspects here. You can't expect me to conclude this in a single video, but say switching to later imperial strategy. We see here a response to the combined pressures of intensified external threats from peoples beyond the frontiers and repeated civil wars over succession, which again make you think, because actually there is a mega continuity also in territorial integrity, right? Throughout, well, it's basically not until the fact of the 5th century that we even say, okay, there is probably the lack of a Roman Empire recognized in the East and in the same West in conventional terms, territorial, legal ones, but that's not in fact all there is, and Romanity continued in the West, arguably even more strongly than in the East, as we explained in many videos. And say, when you look at Constantine's empire, or still Theodosius's ones, like, regardless of changes, you realize it's still the same whole Roman Empire, right? Not much had really changed from the time of Augustus, as a matter of fact. And so that's also something you want to consider, really, because these centuries do not leave a trace. Like, it's not, we should look at, but here it's a bit more, a bit less. It's like literally the fact that there was this thing, whatever you want to call it, of the Roman Empire that lasted for such an enormous amount of time, lasted so long across such an enormous amount of territory, with lots of people sort of even living in it. You shouldn't consider the empire as, okay, well, it's a color on a map. It is literally people made the empire, right? It wasn't much of an outside of an inside per se. Right, it existed definitely in some politically, administratively, strategically meaningful sense. There was an outside and an inside and outside, but again, it was something that hadn't been created. What you want to appreciate about the Western empires that, as we said before, were as China or India and few other places technically, because Mesopotamia and Egypt were overrun. So there is obviously a cultural continuity, but say when we talk about political continuity, also China, India have pretty big problems inside, right? They go through, India was not as developed as China and Rome, but in this sense, also the Chinese have pretty bad things happening to them. I mean, it's a different context indeed, but the nomads there at some point take over much more strongly than anything that happened in the West. The West also had not had that millenary political unity. Like, Rome is able to assert it and create it and to make it live in the following millennia in ways that, in fact, people tend to confuse, because they think, okay, the Chinese, we think of the Chinese, they're the same people, right? They're just like a big hand blob that, however you remix them or rebalance them, it's still China. All right. you should think how different China was. A bit different. It's true that it was very cohesive, ethno-culturally in many ways. There's no doubt, aside also from the barbarian injections. When we talk about Europe, the question should be, like also from this sort of ethno-cultural sense, like why we don't consider as Westerners Europe as cohesive as well. It is true that identitarily speaking, the local identities remained more stronger, but this did not prevent, in fact, an empire from being recognized still in the Middle Ages. And as part of a world that was considered universal within Europe and beyond itself. And so basically, Western civilization is what the entire Western Eurasia revolves around throughout all the following the millennia. After Rome in particular, because the Greeks had not really done this, or at least with Alexander partly, but you don't have the Western Mediterranean, Western Europe in that picture, right? Yet. So what Rome does is way more complex, and it's certainly understandable that by the 19th century, like the idea of national identity would take over in historiography, in pop culture, in the way we represent each other as a European. But we don't understand in that sense that we were cohesively powerful to the point that could even battle against one another and control the world at the same time. And so that is the cohesive factor. That is the uniform factor. That is the identitary aspect, right? So, and it cannot be missed. It cannot simply be reduced to, I don't know, or it is just, no, it was all fragmented. This was not like China. It was not like India. It's essentially a cliche. Like, it's basically deciding that these other cultures were fundamentally more homogeneous than otherwise. It's some sort of sabotage, orientalistic, self-sabotaging, orientalistic view of, again, the East that the Westerners have to learn from. Whereas if you look at what happened historically, like, it's hardly the case to begin with, and it can't be denied that Romanity remained so central in the world, so much that it spread even across some of these other cultures in symbols, in models, and so through the Europeans. So there is something there that probably we haven't still made the right calculations with, historically wise. In late antiquity, the border-based system broke down when one province's garrison was defeated. Reinforcements had to be stripped from other frontiers, sometimes whole legions, more often vexillationes, so detachments from several legions, as a matter of fact. Before, by the way, there are all these wars between the Romans that still are actually the most crippling aspect of this all. And still, this Roman war continues for centuries and centuries. After the 3rd century crisis, the clashes between the Romans in the later period, the quote-unquote barbarians fundamentally are absorbed within the empire. Like, even when they really are undiluted, they are still seeking validation from Rome. They want to be legitimized for their rule, and they inherit as much as possible from that sort of imperial legacy. We've seen it very well with the Franks in particular, but this was the case also for the Ostrogoths, for the Visigoths themselves. I mean, for peoples that we tend to think, okay, they simply substituted themselves as foreign rulers. As long as late antiquity continues, you can't quite make that the case that this was so. The system went on, and even after that, it's more a synthesis of Romano-Germanic identity than some sort of other thing, right? Can you argue that, I don't know, the Eastern Roman Empire was actually more Roman than the Italian peninsula? It's a bit complicated to make that assessment, and you would find strange sort of alchemical elucubrations about this by people who are not particularly aware nor of the history, nor the culture, nor the genetics of this, nor the demographics of these movements, and the same social military ones to begin with. Because people are obsessed with this idea that at some point the Roman Empire crumbled and everything was left in pieces and ruins, whereas, that wasn't quite the case in terms of civilizational continuum. Also, this is not so much stressed for other parts of the world, where this happened and had even more detrimental consequences in terms of civilizational fabric. And as you know, I also very much sort of care about the Latin Germanic identity, Western Europe, post-Roman Europe, because it shows actually, regardless of what certain national narratives would like to stress, or also some catastrophistic ones in other ways, that these places remain the essentially leading ones at so many different cultural and sort of civilizational levels proper, that always instead gets slammed like this were the Dark Ages or whatever. There was allegedly this splendor of the Byzantine Empire and the Caliphate that were more advanced than the West. Really? I made several hours long videos altogether explaining these very things and sort of debunking them. Like Gaul in Italy alone easily competed with the Eastern Roman Empire and whichever, especially fragment of the original caliphate that was never in fact cohesively and directly controlled thing as one. And so we should be extremely careful about what we're really discussing. We're not talking about the papacy that maintains the centrality of Rome metaphysically for all involved here. You have this gradual withdrawal of the Roman legions. You have this gradual erosion of their statal basis, of their resources. There is a deep contraction for everyone, really. This was happening outside the Roman frontier as well, right? But there is also a mental switch. There is also a moral collapse. There is no doubt about it. And perhaps we exaggerated in certain cases. We probably also don't realize how some parts of the empire had already sort of emptied themselves, so that in practice they could be refilled by others that had the capacity of doing so. Even though the institutions and still the people who lived there were the majority, and they propped up, in fact, these experiments that would turn out to be particularly successful. So when you look, but this is perhaps too mechanistic as an idea, but the idea that fort after fort, right, you would gradually witness this collapse where all reinforcements could not really help. Like the idea of the vexillationists being more flexible is also due to, yes, we need to be more present in other places, as there is also demographic collapse, as there is also a this internal strives, and so armies must become more flexible. They can't just sit there. They have to move, and they have to try to prevent, in fact, the enemies to break through from the quote-unquote outside, even though many soldiers were actually recruited from those very peoples. And we underestimate in this sense how many, it's like before, like these, who were the Romans at that point? They were the same peoples that Rome had conquered at large before. And in fact, everybody largely lives still where they had historically lived, right? But now they were Roman, and they consider themselves Roman. This is, I think, the most interesting part of it all that gets also often denied, because at least some people don't like the idea that at some point in the past Rome conquered the world at the end of the day, and would like to sort of do anything possible to deny it, to obscure it, to belittle it, to forget about it. You would have the temporary loss of entire provinces at some point. Is typical of the 3rd century crisis. This required relatively major efforts to recover. It was, however, in the 3rd century relatively easy. There are some provinces. We've seen Dacia, we've seen the Sarmato-Germanic campaigns of Constantine to partly reaffirm some control there. But as you know, there are cost-benefits ratios that simply bring the Romans to, like at that point of Aurelian, that was actually restorer of the world, to simply decide, okay, let's not be in Dacia anymore, just like Britain at some point. Like the Romans pulled out without any even particular pressure in the moment. It just needed those forces elsewhere. And the solution was, at least in this moment of early destabilization after the Principatus era, so to say, from the 3rd century crisis, of the at least development already. This happened mostly for social reasons, other than just sort of broader strategic reforms, right? The creation of central field army, the comitatenses, as we were saying before, alongside the border garrisons that were the limitani instead. This happened simply because the original sort of equality of Roman legionaries, as mostly a plebeian force ruled by, in fact, senators and so on commanded. It had been the same, arguably, since the 4th century BC. Could not had sort of exhausted itself. Antiquity had exhausted itself, and so what happens, moral and material, is that there is a great shift towards an elite, an oligarchy that is able to field sort of better forces. There is also actually a power concentration from the side of the state that is, however, run ever more by sort of monarchic figures and their military entourage, and so an ever more oligarchic aristocracy, telling the truth. And so the Roman legionnaire that was equal to the other, largely, though they were not fully equal, that they weren't even properly considering themselves as such, but were more or less at the same level of free citizens in arms, so to say, disappears. Right? There is also the fact that had been an elite force that had taken over the world, and now everybody else was also a Roman, and so there weren't even simply the auxiliaries to have subordinated roles who needed lighter forces drawn from the same Romans, and also in a moment of greater material scarcity. So it's all a series of issues compounding themselves. This happens also among the other peoples, by the way. We witnessed an oligarchization among the Germans, the Persians, right? Aside from the heavy Romanization they had gone under during the centuries, as it's clearly showed by their way of war and equipment, etc. Now, the late Roman army was a formidable host, right? It could march to a threatened province without stripping defenses elsewhere, for the way it was properly allotted, distributed. This also because it was ever more provincialized to an extent. We looked at its performance in different videos. I will not sort of redescend again in the comparison between the early and late imperial army. Evidently, it's the entire system in late antiquity that is more fragile than before, or at least it's sort of less secure. It leaves more the initiative. It's still very powerful in many ways, especially the Constantinian era is a really positive one overall, but it's different from before. And so while, for example, few people sort of realize this on a regular basis online in pop culture, it's sort of like the late Roman army had a much greater offensive and defensive capacity than the previous one. It's also true that it was less cohesive overall. And so paradoxically, that specialization, that sort of combined arms functioning, had sort of refined itself mostly for the sake of facing crisis. This is true also for certain technological advancements that occur on paper, also through that Hellenic, now Byzantine lens that says, oh, look, all these inventions, and then that's not how really war is fought. Obviously, also before, the Roman army was very much combined arm based. It had all these various specialists from the world out there, but you see, it was lording over them. At this point, it's something else. It's more like preserving this whole group, right? You have also probably an internal fracture. That's actually the greater problem. The fact that an emperor can have his own comitatus, right, is aiming at discouraging rebellion by distant commanders. Usurpations were happen all the time, and these people were, after all, largely confident that the empire was not under this over constant threat. Right? They actually lived through it and realized that they had options, also playing with the federati. They could sort of use it to their own advantage. There were actually massive issues at stake. It was understood that the empire was being sort of undermined by these invasions, but let's say entering in the spiritual temper of late antiquity is something that would require also a history of religion. We already did it at many points. Admittedly, also the enemies that Rome was facing were more aggressive. Like an Alemannic infantry charge was really something. These guys had the same heavy javelins the Romans had been using with such great proficiency. The Persians had also importantly stepped up, also through important Romanization from the Parthian to the Sasanian, to the Sassanid, so to say, to the Sasanian era, into a more sort of state-based system in Mesopotamia, as opposed to the Iranian plateau that could not quite sustain the same level of statehood, in fact. And so it's a complicated picture. The Romans are, however, still the strongest in many ways. We should sort of recover this awareness properly in a military cultural sense. Over time, however, her response could prove too slow for distant crises, leading to the addition of further smaller regional field armies that sort of were the proof of further fragmentation itself. As we explained before, the Limitanei served as frontier troops for local defense and praetorials, while comitatenses formed mobile field armies for major campaigns. Right? There's something sort of stereotypically medieval in the air already. The idea of this mobile elite force and then mostly locals that take care of their own self-defense in an increasingly autonomous but also subordinated way. So you see the dissolution of the empire was actually not mirroring like any positivity that the barbarians from the other side were pushing at the doors. It was because they wanted to settle in the better Roman land and to maintain that, as we've seen, for themselves, battling also against other barbarians as buffer states. So not much had really changed, you see, from the time of client states or whatever. Just the moral shift was the greatest difference, and obviously was also the crucial one. So the so-called defense-in-depth approach replaced earlier preclusive frontier strategies, at least to a greater degree than it had been the case. Telling the truth, in any context, you look at defense strategy, the defense in depth is not an innovation of late antiquity. It had always been there. It exists still today. It's just a form of defensive organization or operational practice. It really depends on the circumstance. The idea is that since Rome was here being invaded, and the landscape was further militarizing or at least fortifying for defense, etc. Of course, this looks like the organized defense in depth. Was there a univocal sort of organization of this? No, right? Every province mostly handled the situation by themselves. There could be an emperor who came to a place and sort of invested some money for reinforcing a specific, but it was very ad hoc, right? There isn't a reform where at some point the Romans sit at a table and say, now from, again, the Adrian Wall to Idumea, we have to establish some sort of more fortifications in depth, and from there they started. That's not how it worked. It was just like a largely autonomous mechanism that mostly there weren't even properly the resources to do anything like this. They barely could even pay for any level of color uniformity in their military clothing. Like, you can imagine how if they could do anything of that scale. Everything was ad hoc, provincial, and with scarce resources, and most of what you see changing is just like an autonomous mechanism that sometimes also was just connected with, okay, we have to get the hell out of here, and nobody will take care of the infrastructure anymore. It will simply decay and ruin, right? Even though the local communities do their best to maintain things working, also the newcomers do, right? This is deeply sort of misunderstood sometimes, how universal the moral and material collapse was. This wasn't a uniquely Roman thing. Rome was the universe, and so we can't speak of it in these terms, but let's say any other people gravitating around it was brought to enter the system if they were capable of doing so. The Huns, say, couldn't, right? The Germans had lived next to the Romans for half of a millennium. They knew how to do that. They were already compatible. They were similar peoples to the Romans to begin with, so they could enter it. And it had already been serving, again, en masse in the Roman army over the centuries. And they, at some point, simply be discharged and go back and live what they live, just a few hundred kilometers from the directly occupied Roman territories sometimes, right? Now, other difficulties arose from slow communications across the vast empire in the moment of crisis. You have also the growing administrative burden of extracting sufficient taxes from an increasingly impoverished population to sustain the enlarged army. So it's not much like the world simply evolved itself. It's true that the moral collapse also corresponds to some greater decline of civilization, of life quality, this perception of the world, and etc. However, it's not like, so at this point, like an army could not cross Europe and they had a reason for doing so. Or they didn't know, say, how to build torsion catapults anymore. But this is a bit the catastrophistic notion or version of the story. It's obvious that if you have less resources and you have to sort of remain in charge, you mostly think from your own immediate basis, right? Also before, this was the same world. If you think about it, you can think of overexhaustion of certain resources. You can imagine like a change, but de facto, right? It was the same world. Like everything was there. When you look at civilizational collapse, this is hardly ever something material or external, environmental, climatic. It is basically people. Like it's politics, it's wars. Active destruction is active sort of destructuring, sabotage, sort of fear, self-crippling. And that's how eventual collapses occur. It's not because people weren't particularly rich, right? Or, look at the barbarians. They weren't more than the Romans. They weren't richer than the Romans. So what happened there? We're more desperate, more militarized, right, at large. They are displaced. They're pressed by others. They are even angrier and more sort of displaced than them. Look at the Huns. And so it is a struggle of moral forces that reciprocally influence one another and that create an incredible blend and synchrosis that it is still the one that Europe witnesses today. So these strains eventually exceeded the capacity of a single ruler as well. Experiments with up to 4 emperors during the Tetrarchy, as you know, through varying seniority were attempted. The final arrangement divided the empire into eastern and western halves. You see how fast we're running here. The 2 emperors usually, but not always, cooperated. This is also an aspect that interested me, that there were some quasi-wars between the East and the West at some point, but if you really look at their general cooperation and the type of deals that they brokered with one another, there wasn't this great level of sort of hostility. Like the idea that the empire could and would work on the basis of the 2 halves together was pretty much out there. For example, at the Battle of Cape Bon, when in the mid-5th century, the Eastern Romans tried to retake with a massive naval expedition Vandalic Africa, and only a chieftain of the caliber of Gaiseric was able to save the day. Had the Eastern Romans been victorious, Roman Africa would have actually remained, would have been properly entrusted again to the Western government of Ravenna. They weren't stealing in the sense promises. This would actually happen in the Illyricum to a degree. What you see eventually later as the Byzantine Empire actually came to control some parts of today's Serbo-Croatian territories that were at some point simply taken over because there were people in the West, including Federati, that had been installed there. But say the same Theodoric, in fact, in Ravenna, controlled everything up to the Danube in the north, so today's Bavaria, and included and up to Belgrade in the east. So up to, in fact, running down the Danube itself. So the scale of governability of these territories is probably underrated. It's something that also when you study medieval history, as a medievalist, this always impressed me, that the idea that at some point the political fragmentation of Europe on paper, so to say, on map, would correspond to some level of civilizational shortcoming is completely wrong. I mean, if you look at Romano-Germanic kingdoms in the 6th century, you have, again, Theodoric Italy with all these other territories, pretty darn big. Like the Visigoths control almost all of Spain and almost everything south west of the Loire, Aquitaine, basically. You have sort of pretty big expanses of power that at the time did not have the resources that those same countries would have when, I don't know, the peak of medieval history. So be extremely careful in thinking that even when a power disintegrates, it's simply the measure of some local level of sort of some underdevelopment per se, right? There is something else, something more ghostly at play. over the structure, right? The Western Empire, as you know, disintegrated toward the end of the 5th century, after having proved that it could basically still reconquer Spain, for example. This happened before Gaiseric put himself in between in Spain, the Visigoths and Majoranus. The Visigoths at that point would have surrendered just as much. Gaiseric, hadn't he ruled the Vandals, would have witnessed his people surrendering to the aforementioned Eastern Roman expedition. It was massive, by the way. There was this very easy likelihood that the Western Empire could easily go on. There was nothing deterministic about the end of the western half of the empire, right? It could have been easy to see like a Western Empire, the arrival of the Arabs down the line. And if the West had continued to exist, probably wouldn't even have the Islamic invasions as we know them. Not much because there would have been something more consistent to withstand them, but let's say probably because the existence of the Western Empire would have impacted the East in ways that would have not even allowed the rise of Islam at some point. But also, we must explain why things happened the way they did. As you know, I don't like what-ifs at all. The Eastern half survived for another 8 centuries, right, with great modifications, but still fundamentally pivoting around essentially an Aegean civilization. That's what basically the Byzantines are. They are objectively a direct continuity of Hellenic civilization in many ways, albeit a Romanized one. And so the passage of Rome was definitely not some random accident, and that's why that empire proudly bore the name of Roman, even though their own ways, and sometimes even with titles that you would be surprised how they were often more sometimes probably deviating from the full Romanity in terminology, because it's easy to say, oh, but the Byzantines call themselves Roman. Go watch my videos on the intro on Byzantine history and see how actually they changed some of their official titles and institutional offices and so on in ways that at some point were not actually going in the Roman direction. Aside from their culture, and again, one can debate that, but what matters is they kept considering themselves Romans. And so I don't need to here recount the history of Constantinople. That I would like to stress, however, was founded not just because it was an advantageous place where to rule from. As you know, there were new centers. Rome had remained the undisputed center of the world in all metaphysical ways. This was the same throughout all Christian history as well. Rome was objectively more important than Jerusalem, even in that sort of Christian lens, and it would remain that as such. The interesting aspect about the rise of Constantinople, there had been, again, other centers like, I don't know, Trier, Milan, Singidunum, Nicomedia, etc. And there were big cities out there. Actually, the biggest cities remained in the west, admittedly concentrated in Italy, but so they actually were in the west. Say at the time of Justinian, that here we are concluding about. Constantinople was largely established as the see of a senate that could be controlled, unlike the Roman one. In other words, the mighty and powerful Constantine that founded Byzantine civilization, and so this other sort of paradigm of a Pontic Aegean empire that straddled Asia and Europe was, and more obviously in a sense in the Eastern Mediterranean, was essentially doing so to distance himself from the power of the Roman Senate and the Romano-Italic senatorial elite, in fact, oligarchy. And this is, I would say, this is underrated in explaining also certain divides that existed between the empire. It's not much the decline of Italy per se that created issues. After, if you look at the West, Italy remained the center of the empire. So even the East did not really have a clear province that was so central per se. right? What is central is truly Constantinople as a city, the control of the straits. And yes, there are some important provinces, but none of them are actually central. It's more like this thalassocratically oriented Greco-Byzantine force that reactivates, in fact, in a very Greek way, whereas the Italian landmass until the end of the Western Roman Empire is the central one, right? It's only basically, and it's not even in the Middle Ages, when you look at the reactivation of the Holy Roman Empire, you have, and also with the Carolingian Empire for that matter, you have a true center of the empire again. Like Italy remains actually the richest place, and the one to which, interestingly enough, also in the Middle Ages, the imperial crown was connected. There isn't such a thing like, okay, emperors were nominated north of the Alps, right? Even when this starts happening, de facto, it's because Germany has passed from sort of an empire to sort of Central Europe. So when we look at the political, cultural, and historical geography of Western Europe in particular, realize that there is something about Romanity and the historical level of development of the Italian peninsula and the areas that had been more Romanized that maintain like a centrality and a sort of an entity on its own, as opposed to the other major chunks of the West that go on all as successful countries like France, Spain, England, de facto Britain, as we go on, and the same Germany. This can't be denied. Where is this in the East? Which kind of country actually looks like that? Right? We can't even say Greece, because obviously from one side of the hand there is Turkey, that also contains what I will refuse to call the other name, but in fact Constantinople, that we'll retake at some point, of course. But you see what I mean. Like, this is not really, of course you can't say that there's a Syria, there's an Egypt. I'm not denying that, but say those also were lost relatively early in an Eastern Roman sense. So you want to appreciate this aspect. While I made a video about the Italian genetic dominance in the Roman legions in the first centuries of the empire, Roman armies were never composed exclusively of Italians in the imperial period. All right, de facto, essentially, like, Roman armies are at least Italian as long as, well, basically the empire, the imperial period, because there were colonies of Italians that you can't dare. How eventually other provinces were Romanized, and you can see that they had blended with the local populations. But the majority already by the imperial times is, in fact, even sometimes of Italian colonists, but settled elsewhere. So be careful, for example, when you hear up at some point the already by the first centuries of the empire, you have the Gauls, the Syrians. Some of these people were actually of Italian descent, just like the emperors. Say, Trajan was Spanish. Surely they had partly married with the local aristocracy. This had actually happened also with the Diadochoi. But they were largely and still Roman in the sense that they were also connected with the broader senatorial elite of the empire, was dominantly Italian, right? But indeed, the auxiliaries were by half, and so literally half of them were not at that point Italian, and the more time passed, obviously, the less Italy remained central. Say, up to, we see that especially Italy with a perception of its own centrality and dominance in the empire actually goes on longer than we think. Also, by the time of Maximinus, we mentioned before, as you know, there was a war against him. There was essentially a war against Italy and some parts also of Africa, with the senatorial elite had sort of grafted, because it was an incredibly rich place also as well for grain imports into same Italy, closer than Egypt, that mostly fed other places. And the Italians represent themselves still as the imperium holders, to which they had been habituated for quite a long time, telling the truth. Right? Essentially, for half of a millennium, they are the center. They are the leaders. They are the commanders, right? And they continue to represent themselves like this. There is expectedly as well, a radical municipal identitary continuity in Italy. Not just because of its precocious urbanization, also thanks to Romanization, but because of what constitutes still the center of politics, that is the city itself. And in fact, when you look at what I was saying before in terms of continuity from the Antiquity to the Middle Ages, I also made some videos about this. We don't see a fracture in urban culture. Some, in the Italian peninsula, some centers were abandoned during late Antiquity, the early Middle Ages, but there isn't that deep sort of depopulation or discontinuity of settlement. More or less, the major Roman cities were the same ones you see in the Italian communal era as city-states on their own. So there is a striking municipal continuity. We know it also from epigraphic evidence. We know that the local clans considered highly themselves as sort of probably nobiliar figures that ruled the cities, made them go on. These were of the senatorial class in many cases, and they also continued later during the medieval era. So it's a very interesting mechanic at play. So in Caesar's times, so to say, the legionaries were mainly Italian, but Gauls, Spaniards, Pannonians, and others quickly joined and soon formed the majority. A legionnaire had to be a citizen and use a Latin name, but this said little about his actual origins at some point. Under the early empire, non-citizens enlisted in auxiliary cohorts and wings, so the cohortes and ally, received citizenship on discharge so their sons could join the legions. If you're interested in this, again, I made an entire video about also the connubium laws, how the same soldiers could marry with or not marry with local women depending on the circumstances and the ages. There would be also kind of, like, it's not law was uniformly applied and or simply sort of applicable to begin with. So we tend to have, again, perhaps too much of a statalistic and centralistic idea of the empire that never existed, not even when in late antiquity there was objectively an effort at centralization to maintain control on especially arms and armor production in the more core land, sort of the core Mediterranean areas of the empire, right? Much more close. In fact, that was also not a relatively Byzantine thing, as it happened elsewhere as well, but it mostly was tied to city government. It was mostly tied to like a form of organized civilization that obviously was gradually contracting, and in some cases even withdrawing in the fringes of the empire. In the later empire, recruits from outside the frontiers, the so-called Symmachari, were commonly taken into the auxiliary and cavalry vexillationes because they didn't have any auxiliary to draw from within the boundaries as well. And so there were lots of Germans, lots of Berbers. Some of these had served in the Roman legion since ever, right? And so, in fact, there isn't even much of a difference, again, between the type of auxiliaries used in de facto and also in how they would be practically spent, if not partially for geographical origin, right? This mattered, obviously, in a cultural and moral sense. Some of these people later became, they saw an opportunity in this, but they were not so attached as the more civilized peoples of the empire to that idea of Rome, at least in the way we intended. Some of them were actually blinded and fascinated by it to the point that they would even want to maintain it, but it was often an expedient, right? Think about the Mauritanian chunk of the empire survived in the West, allegedly just by name, because they thought that that was how they had been ruled by the Romans for a long time. They sort of even in a fringe area, in a frontier area where Roman presence had not been so radical and iron-fisted, but still, in fact, this was the expedient of it. When the Arabs arrived there, they take down what were apparently still very Roman-sounding titles. And we'll talk about this because, as you know, the Byzantines themselves had projected their control up to the Straits on the Atlantic, and they had controlled parts of the Andalusian coast, even when the Visigoths were in the hinterland. So there's a lot there to untangle, to unpack, and we should make more videos about that. Toward the end, many regular troops in the Western Empire were drawn exactly from those African provinces, even though, again, as everything sort of regionalized again, forces were local, right? Say in Spain, Gaul, Italy, etc. Like, there were mostly people from the local places, and or more often at that point from the sort of Western Eurasian populations that were reversing themselves. We were talking about Germans, Iranic peoples of all kinds, Turks, like the Huns. We know this fairly well, right? And we will come back again on different aspects of this late Roman army, multi-ethnic melange that it was, really. Also, while there was a continuity with some legions that existed in Caesar times, you still find the name at the time of Justinian, right? But there was also gradual stratification. When you look at the army that reconquered the West under Belisarius and Narses, its organization was actually very heterogeneous, was very messy. You know, it made sense. It was an organic force, but its origins were now the sort of puzzle of what had been a much more unitary and also ethnically sort of hierarchically established empire that evidently at this point was something very different. So here we got to 2 hours and a half. For some reason, the last video was merely 2 hours. Like the first one was 2 hours and a half. And so what to say? There is definitely more to add here. It felt like a marathon because when you talk about Roman history, I already made 200. This is the 260th video. So it's actually a lot, but it feels for some reason when it gets to Roman history, we would never talk enough about it, right? Schwerpunkt had this original tendency to cover different sort of manualistic aspects of Roman history, sometimes to talk about things a bit more in general, not too overly specifically, unless, again, there were things that we covered in very ultra-specific ways. When you talk about the Roman military, we can, for example, make videos like this as well as military historical units, etc. Nevertheless, right, it seems that the overall picture that we can draw is always too small than it deserves. And this is indeed the case for every video that we are every topic that we can cover, but it doesn't mean that it has to remain like this. Like, there is definitely a lot to cover more, but these videos, as I said at the beginning of the first one of this episode, are needed because if we didn't talk about this broader horizon first, we would not be able to address even the in-depth videos. You wouldn't have, I mean, I'm aware that you would obviously be able to get the point of it all, but sometimes it's even like the fundamentals, as I said also today, that may properly eschew, like could shift like an entire perception without making you fully aware of it. Of maybe there are just some things that you would never really think that were a thing or heard of, seen that perspective. That is always useful. So I don't know how many people are going to watch this. I see that my recent video on like the first one of the series got over 1,100 views, and the second 460. So we're almost at 1,600. So this other one is probably going to bring it to 2,000 in the first week. So indeed, right, these views matter, and they are connected with the depth of the history itself, with what we can fit even in these broader videos through the more specialized ones. And we will surely go on with this. We can't spoiler you, for example, how random is the next Roman army video, except unless it's a special, so to say. There's a Byzantine thing here. It's not quite Roman. The other one, yes, archaic armament. You see, that is a very much needed topic that we had never covered as a whole. And then there is yet another Byzantine thing, and here before another Roman stuff. It's probably going to take a while. There's something about the Vandals at some point coming. But you see, it's also, you can say rare, but it depends on what you're going to cover. You have this more compact, completely themed amount of videos, and then for a while you will not hear much of it. There is, from far ahead, sort of months from now, some Roman campaigns from the Antonine to the, I don't remember when, maybe a period to Adrianople or something like that. I don't remember. We'll talk about this with inadequate time, but we're saying it never really ends. There's so much to cover. It never ends. I was saying yesterday in the 3 million views thanks video, like it never ends. So we can exploit this as much as we can. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.